I've never been comfortable around moths. Something about the way they flutter erratically toward light sources, their dusty wings leaving powder on everything they touch, and those feathery antennae that seem to sense things we can't. It was unfortunate timing when I discovered my girlfriend Maya shared this phobia. As the more composed one in our relationship, I naturally became the designated moth removal specialist. Initially, this involved a lot of nervous fumbling with drinking glasses and pieces of cardboard, but over the years, I gradually became less reactive to their presence. Fear is draining, and the whole theatrical performance that comes with it grows tiresome. The jumping, the squealing, the dramatic gestures. Eventually, I found myself becoming almost methodical about it. I still didn't enjoy having one land on me, but they no longer sent me into full panic mode. Maya had always been moderately bothered by moths, nothing that seemed particularly severe or concerning. For the first 8 years we'd been together, she displayed typical lepidopterophobia, quick exits from rooms when one appeared, requests for me to handle the situation, the occasional shudder. Everything changed after that humid evening in late August when we returned from dinner at her sister's place. The weather had been stifling all week, one of those oppressive heat waves that makes the air feel thick and suffocating. I remember setting my keys on the kitchen counter and turning to see Maya pulling off her cardigan. She sighed with relief, running her fingers through her damp hair, then froze. Her expression shifted to confusion as she examined something caught in her auburn curls. When she pulled her hand away, a large brown moth was clinging to her fingers, its wings spread wide and trembling. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd heard from her before. She flung the creature across the room and began frantically slapping at her hair and shoulders, crying, "Get it off me! Get it off!" Even though it was already gone. I rushed to her side, checking her hair thoroughly while she hyperventilated. She stripped off her blouse right there in the kitchen, convinced more insects were hiding in the fabric. We sat at the breakfast table afterward, drinking chamomile tea while she kept scratching at her scalp. "Disgusting thing," she whispered, half laughing through tears. "Did you see how big it was? The wingspan must have been 3 inches. I nodded sympathetically, though honestly, I'd only caught a glimpse of it tumbling across the tiles before it disappeared under the refrigerator. It had been substantial, though, definitely one of the larger specimens I'd encountered in our apartment. Just the memory of it made my skin crawl, but I pushed down my own discomfort to focus on comforting Maya. "It's probably still in here somewhere," she said, shivering. "What if there are more?" I wanted to reassure her, but lying seemed cruel. "We'll seal up the bedroom tonight and I'll search for it tomorrow," I promised. She made me check every inch of our bed before she'd get under the covers. Throughout the night, she kept brushing at her hair and touching her neck. I felt terrible watching her suffer. When someone you love is in distress, their pain becomes your pain. Neither of us slept well, but I was primarily worried about her psychological state rather than any lingering moths. The problem didn't resolve itself after that first night. The second evening was identical, then the third, fourth, and beyond. There was a brief improvement during the second week, but then Maya saw a nature documentary featuring Luna moths and the anxiety returned with renewed intensity. Every night became the same ritual. I had to strip all the bedding, examine every fold and crevice, and she even removed the lamp from her nightstand to eliminate potential hiding spots. Meanwhile, I was tasked with hunting down the original intruder. In Maya's words, she'd never feel secure in our home until I found that monster and eliminated it. Looking back, I'm not entirely certain what I witnessed that first night, but I'll admit I didn't search very diligently. I did discover some unusual cocoons around the apartment, thick, papery structures that were difficult to remove from surfaces. I found several of these formations throughout our space, but I never mentioned them to Maya. One concealed a gap in the baseboard that should have concerned me, but I simply ignored it. I overlooked many things during that period. Dead beetles wrapped in silky threads, holes chewed through the pantry shelves and filled with fibrous material. Nothing about any of it was normal, but I covered it up and moved on. It's difficult to explain this behavior in retrospect. Perhaps my attention was elsewhere. Maya's condition was deteriorating, and she was slowly becoming worse. She cried frequently, and any light contact on her skin would trigger episodes of panicked swatting. She couldn't eat a meal without constantly brushing at imaginary insects on her arms. The situation reached a crisis point when I came home to find her cutting off all her hair with kitchen scissors. She explained that she was tired of mistaking the sensation of her own hair for moth wings, so this was the most logical solution. If you've ever lived with someone experiencing a psychological breakdown, there's usually a moment when your heart sinks as you realize you're dealing with something beyond the ordinary. It's genuinely frightening. It reminded me of when my father received his cancer diagnosis, that same isolating fear. I remember lying awake that night, thinking about how I'd found Maya hunched over the bathroom sink, scissors in hand, with patches of scalp visible through her butchered hair. When she looked up at me, she smiled, but her eyes were so unnaturally wide that I felt like I was looking at a stranger. Have you ever felt lonely for someone while they're sitting right next to you? I'd make her coffee and breakfast, we'd discuss our days, but it felt like conversing with an empty shell. Every day followed the same pattern. I'd share stories from work, and she'd tell me about scrubbing the bedroom for hours searching for cocoons, or how she'd started pulling up carpet edges to check for larvae nests. Eventually I realized she'd stopped going to her job entirely, but she wouldn't give me straight answers when I asked about it. When I called her office directly, they wouldn't take my calls, which felt like a bad sign. It was almost a relief when she was hospitalized. Everything unraveled at once. She'd taken a hammer to one of the bedroom walls, convinced there was a massive moth infestation behind the drywall. She didn't realize it was just the adjacent apartment on the other side. I was at work during the incident, but apparently things escalated quickly. The police arrived to find a partially bald woman screaming about moths in the walls. By the time I got home, they'd already transported her for psychiatric evaluation. I rushed to visit her, but in the meantime had to contact her parents, which was actually a relief because I wasn't handling the situation alone anymore. Until then, I'd been too embarrassed to discuss it with anyone, unsure of the proper etiquette around someone else's mental health crisis. She was only gone for one night, less than 18 hours really. The neighbors agreed not to press charges if I paid for repairs and Maya received treatment. Her parents are financially comfortable, so they helped us with the costs. They found a specialized clinic where she stayed for several weeks. It focused on exposure therapy, which essentially means gradually acclimating someone to their phobia. Afraid of heights? Spend progressively more time on elevated platforms. Afraid of moths? Start with pictures and work up to live specimens. This is an oversimplification, of course. It's a structured program involving carefully controlled increases in exposure intensity. The first night she called and told me they'd shown her cartoon illustrations of moths and discussed her traumatic experience. They were just simple drawings, but she said even those were challenging. She cried and I cried too. She was only 3 hours away, but I hated being separated from her, and everything had happened so suddenly. It was barely 2 months between that sweltering August night and her admission to the clinic, but in that brief span I felt like my entire foundation had crumbled. She spent 3 weeks at the facility. I don't remember that period clearly. There were nightly phone calls. She was improving, she told me, and her doctor confirmed her progress. It was difficult work, certainly. They had to sedate her the day they transitioned from drawings to actual photographs of moths. Apparently she became aggressive with a staff member. My time alone in the apartment was lonely and somewhat strange, if I'm being honest. I woke up one morning with what looked like moth scales on my pillow, and at some point I realized I hadn't seen a single moth in our home for weeks, not even the tiny ones that usually gathered around the bathroom light. I briefly wondered what had been leaving those dusty residues around the place, but never investigated further. My thinking feels muddled when I try to remember this period. I do recall finding more dead insects wrapped in silk behind the kitchen cabinets. One morning I discovered a small bird encased in a cocoon on our fire escape. No indication of what had done it though. I just stared at it while drinking my coffee, then left for work. When I returned that evening, it was gone. This probably isn't the best time to mention that I was diagnosed with early onset dementia some time ago. I suppose that's meant to help explain things, right? I'm not sure. It doesn't feel explanatory to me. There's no family history of neurological issues. Doctors say a brain affected by dementia resembles a moth-eaten tapestry, full of holes where memories should be. That's an apt description of how my mind feels from the inside. Thoughts travel along familiar pathways and then simply vanish. Maya's therapy progressed well, though. I remember that quite vividly. The phone calls and the sound of her voice. Remarkably clear memories. God, I missed her terribly during this time. I hate being overly sentimental, but it had been a challenging and isolating 2 months, and hearing her sound increasingly confident and happy with each conversation was like receiving an injection of pure joy. I missed her desperately and wanted her home. When she told me, giggling with delight, that she'd allowed a small moth to land on her finger on day 18, I broke down crying right along with her. I felt proud of her achievement and relief that we might be returning to normal. Like the nightmare was finally ending. It wasn't so straightforward when I saw her in person. She returned looking like a war survivor. I should say she looked beautiful, but I want to be truthful. I smiled when I saw her, but it didn't reach my eyes because the woman who got into my car looked decades older than the woman who'd been living with me just a few months earlier. She was skeletal, with gray, papery skin and a shaved head that made her appear fragile as porcelain. Her eyes weren't right either, but she was smiling, so I suppressed the uneasy feeling in my stomach and pretended everything was fine. Her job was no longer available, and I managed to get some time off after speaking with my supervisor. It was just the two of us, which can feel awkward for a couple accustomed to full-time work schedules. I was on edge, uncertain what to expect. She smiled frequently, trying to reassure me, and I asked many questions about the therapy experience. She said it was transformational, showing me photographs of herself with large moths perched on her hands, some with wingspans as wide as dinner plates. I had to suppress my own revulsion while looking at them. She said that was from day 20, but when I asked about day 21, she said it was mostly just paperwork and goodbyes. There's a harsh reality about relationships that few people acknowledge. Time only moves forward. Maya hadn't done anything wrong and I bore her no ill will, but something had shifted between us. All the good intentions in the world couldn't bridge that gap. She'd changed, been changed more accurately. At the time I couldn't articulate any of it, but I felt uncertain how to interact with her. When I kissed her, it was on the forehead. When I embraced her, it felt like hugging a distant relative. I didn't understand my own emotions, and wouldn't until I found her one morning in the kitchen, tapping gently on a mason jar and giggling like a child. It wasn't the light, musical laughter I was accustomed to. It sounded more like children encouraging cruelty or cheering on a bully. She didn't acknowledge me when she looked up. She just returned her attention to the jar and continued laughing, drumming her fingers against the glass. When I walked around the counter, I saw what was inside, a massive moth, larger than any I'd encountered before. I don't know what's considered normal in other parts of the world, but a typical household moth in our region might have a 2-inch wingspan. This creature was enormous, with wings pressed against the sides of the jar like folded leather, and seeing it made me jump backward. I realized I hadn't seen another moth since that humid August night, and this thing with wings as broad as my palm was a genuine shock. I cried out, and Maya started howling with laughter. I mean, she reacted like a toddler discovering something hilarious for the first time. Manic and strange and so intensely delighted, but in a way that felt alien because I couldn't understand the thoughts and feelings behind that ear-splitting cackle, and it was completely wrong coming from her. I waited for her to speak, but she didn't. She just laughed until something in her exhausted itself and she slowly quieted, but still didn't say anything even after she'd gone silent. Finally, I broke the standoff. I had no idea what to say. The entire time she was staring at me with her patchy hair and gleeful, teary eyes, and I became so desperate to end the tension that I stammered out, "That's quite a specimen, isn't it?" Her expression softened. Her shoulders dropped. She slipped out of that manic state like shedding a costume. "They'll get much larger," she said. Then she unscrewed the jar lid, snatched the moth out, and stuffed it into her mouth. I didn't see it completely, not the full process, but I stood frozen in horror and watched the muscles in her poorly shaved head tense and relax as her jaw worked, crunching through those delicate wings. The sounds were awful enough, but when she finished, She looked at me over her shoulder and smiled, and her teeth were stained brown and gold with bits of wing and antenna still stuck in her gums. Me own Elsa's mental health crisis. I'd been too embarrassed to discuss it with anyone, unsure of the proper etiquette around someone else's mental health crisis. I'm not entirely certain what happened next, but I finally understood why I'd felt so different around her since her return. I was afraid of her, like a child around an unpredictable adult. I never knew what version of her I'd encounter. There was always this energy in the room that kept me on edge. I'd sit watching television but couldn't focus on the content. Instead, every fiber of my being was concentrated on monitoring her. Every breath, every movement. When she got up to use the bathroom, I'd watch intently to see what she might do. The fact that she usually behaved normally was even more unsettling because I knew something was fundamentally wrong, and I couldn't stop remembering the way she'd laughed with that creature in the jar. Nights became unbearable. Often I'd wake with the sensation that she'd been watching me, but she'd appear to be sleeping. Sometimes there were subtle movements suggesting she'd just rolled over. I got used to it, assumed it was probably paranoia, but then one night I woke to find her face inches from mine. I couldn't help crying out. I scrambled backward trying to avoid contact and ended up falling off the bed. When I looked up from the floor, she had a completely blank expression, just staring at me like a predator studying prey. "What are you doing?" I demanded, unable to keep the irritation from my voice. She shrugged. "Just watching." Then she rolled over as if nothing had happened. That night I slept on the couch. She didn't ask why, didn't say a word as I gathered my things and left the bedroom. I wasn't sure I'd be able to fall asleep after that, but exhaustion won. When I woke up, there were moth scales in my hair. I was fortunate to get more than a few hours of sleep after that. Came sporadically, if at all. I woke repeatedly to sensations of something brushing across my face and arms, like someone drawing feathers over my skin. Each time I jolt awake in panic, but found nothing except nearly invisible dust clinging to me. Life without proper sleep was brutal, and I struggled to hide my growing aversion to Maya. Our routines diverged further apart. I stopped going upstairs almost entirely, had no reason to. I had work, the couch, and the kitchen, and days when I barely saw Maya at all were preferable. I wanted distance from her, something that broke my heart, honestly. There were moments I wanted to reconnect, but looking at her gave me an uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. I didn't want to change our dynamic, didn't want to get closer. If anything, I felt a powerful urge to literally run away from her. It was horrible feeling that way about someone I loved, and trying to process those emotions was enough to give me headaches. I became extremely forgetful during this period, and it was much later before I realized I'd never paid for the wall repairs. I think it slipped my mind completely. I emphasize think, because I can't remember what I've forgotten. I just nailed some plywood over the hole and moved on. For months later, it suddenly occurred to me that I should have done something more substantial. I did find a contractor's business card in the kitchen that wasn't mine. I might have called for an estimate. I don't know. But once I remembered I'd never properly fixed the damage, I was filled with shame and embarrassment and decided to face it directly by apologizing to my neighbor. I'd never known much about the woman next door. She was middle-aged, worked in healthcare, drove a small blue car, and kept her curtains drawn most of the time. I knew she lived alone though, and when I knocked and got no answer, it didn't seem unusual. At least not until I went back inside and heard movement on the other side of the wall. So I returned and knocked several more times, thinking she might not have heard me, but there was still no response. I found this odd. She'd always seemed straightforward, the type who'd either answer the door or tell you to go away. I went back and tried to see through her windows, but couldn't make out anything, and when I peered through her mail slot, there was what looked like gauze blocking the opening. When my fingers came away covered in a sticky powder, I had a terrible sinking feeling. I couldn't have explained how, but I was convinced Maya had done something. After all, it was this neighbor who'd called the police about Maya's wall hammering incident. But I couldn't very well break down her door, and I wasn't about to climb through any windows. Fortunately, we shared a small courtyard in the back. It was easy enough to hop the low fence, and from there I could check the rear windows. She'd left the kitchen blinds partially open, and at first what I saw confused me. For a moment I wondered if she was redecorating because everything appeared to be covered in translucent sheeting. But paying closer attention, I realized that didn't make sense. When renovating a kitchen, you don't drape protective covering over half-eaten meals and dirty dishes. The material over everything was cloudy and fibrous, obviously some kind of silk. It took considerable effort to resist the urge to simply hop back over the fence and pretend I'd seen nothing. But if she needed help, I knew I had to try. I noticed a cell phone on the ground by her back door. It was strangely prominent, making me think whoever had dropped it had done so hastily. It didn't make sense that someone would drop it there without noticing, unless they'd been distracted by something urgent. I picked it up and winced when it came free with a sticky tearing sound. It was covered in barely visible silk threads. I desperately wanted that door to be locked. Couldn't imagine anything worse than having to go inside. But I tried the handle and it turned easily. The door opened with minimal effort and I got a clear view of how every surface in that place was covered in pale webs that grew thicker and denser as my gaze penetrated deeper into the house. I had to wonder if they were strong enough to trap a person. Was my neighbor somewhere inside? Someone was there. I knew that from the noises I'd heard, but I couldn't see her in the kitchen. I wanted to call out, maybe even venture inside to search, but the hallway beyond the kitchen had been transformed into a silk-lined tunnel. No sharp angles, just a dark cocoon-like passage whose curved walls rippled gently in the breeze. I stared into that darkness, trying to determine if there was a human shape wrapped somewhere in the pale webbing. I leaned forward, my head and shoulders crossing the threshold, when the darkness sprouted wings. A massive shape exploded toward me faster than my mind could process. Before my heart could skip a beat, it had nearly reached the kitchen, then stopped abruptly in the center of the room, standing perfectly still and bold in the fading daylight. A creature with wings spanning 6 feet. A genuine monster. I didn't move. It took another full minute for my brain to consciously process what I was seeing. My nervous system reacted faster, of course. It was like being smothered in disgust and terror. My stomach dropped. My skin crawled. My heart felt ready to explode. But my actual mind went blank, white noise and static. The creature was enormous. So large its wings barely fit in the hallway behind it. But in the kitchen with more space, those appendages and probing antennae spread out like tentacles, gripping the doorframe. It was poised to attack whatever had disturbed its web. I've read that moths, like many insects, don't always react to single stimuli. They need multiple triggers. Looking down at my feet, I saw I'd taken just one step inside, but that was enough to alert it. Now it had investigated the initial disturbance and, essentially blind, it waited for another indication of something trapped in its web. I had to wonder, would lifting my foot register as that second trigger? Did I have a choice? I couldn't remain there. Looking at the thing was pushing me closer to complete panic with every passing second. I had to act while maintaining some semblance of control. I slid my foot backward. The moth didn't react. As soon as both feet were outside, I released the door handle and felt something sticky detach from my palm. It seems like hyperbole to say lightning moves more slowly. I don't think I have adequate words to describe its speed. Most people have seen nature documentaries with striking snakes or hunting spiders and thought, wow, that was fast. But this creature, maybe it was just because it was coming directly at me. I've never witnessed anything like it outside of edited video. Suddenly it was simply there, and before I knew it, massive fuzzy legs were pinning me to the ground and I was staring into a coiled proboscis framed by antennae as thick as my wrists. They moved independently, and something about seeing all those wing scales and segmented body parts clustered together sent my mind reeling. I mentioned at the beginning that years of exposure had helped manage my fear of moths, but there are limits. I lost consciousness. When I regained awareness, darkness surrounded me completely. I didn't know it then, but I was in what had been my neighbor's living room. It wasn't absolutely black, but it took several terrifying minutes for my vision to adjust enough to see my own body trapped beneath me. I was wrapped tightly, and if you've ever heard that moth silk is incredibly strong and doubted it, trust me, it's true. A few light strands don't give you a proper sense of it. but I was encased in what must have been layers of the material and felt like I was wearing multiple sizes too small compression garments. There was minimal give, enough to wiggle fingers or toes, or bend a knee slightly, but that was all. It was terrifying. I'm not particularly claustrophobic, but given the circumstances, I found myself panicking as I struggled for leverage. I kept thinking if I could hook a finger into the wrapping, maybe I could start tearing it apart. I was desperate, but the more I fought, the more I realized it was hopeless. The silk was elastic and strong and covered in thick, tacky adhesive that further restricted my movement as my struggles spread it around, gluing my limbs together. It wasn't until exhaustion forced me to rest that I realized I wasn't alone. There was another cocoon beside me. My neighbor had been a sturdy woman in life, average height with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes. But in the dim light of that room, she looked like a mummy, so thin and dehydrated you could see every bone beneath her papery skin. I nearly cried, realizing I'd risked everything to save someone who was already dead. But that wasn't accurate. My mistake became clear when she opened her eyes and looked at me with pure, absolute terror. She opened her mouth and I expected her to scream, but instead she coughed and gagged, and something wet and brown oozed from her lips. It dropped down her chin and landed on the floor between us. It resembled a hair elastic covered in bile, and I was momentarily puzzled until I saw a thin brown wing unfold from the tangled mass. "It's all right." My neighbor's body relaxed completely, her eyes becoming vacant and confused, as Maya knelt beside me and stroked my hair. "Maya, you have to help me." "Shoo," she said, pressing a finger to my lips. "It's all right. Everything will be fine." Behind her, a shadow appeared. It had wings that reached from floor to ceiling. "It won't be much longer now," she added as the darkness behind her grew. "Better to keep you here." "Maya, what the hell? I told you they'd get much larger," she said, nodding toward the moth my neighbor had just expelled. "She won't be much use now." She touched my neighbor's forehead, but there was barely any response. The woman just stared blankly as Maya rolled her over to face away from me. "For such an intelligent species," she added as she parted the woman's hair. "I'm always curious how much you miss." Something was attached to the back of her head. A pulsing bulb of mottled brown and gray tissue. It looked like a moth without wings. A massive larva, perhaps. That's what I thought until Maya ran a finger playfully along its surface and my neighbor let out a gut-wrenching wail. Slowly, the shape writhed and a long thin appendage emerged from beneath its body, and I realized I was looking at a moth wrapped around her skull, its legs buried beneath the skin and muscle of her scalp. For a moment it curled the appendage in the air before returning it to the incision and sliding it back inside, every inch disappearing with a horrible wet sound. It displaced tissue and hair, and when it settled, I could see how misshapen her skull had become from all those legs wrapped tight around her head. "What the hell?" I gasped. "Do you ever find it strange that you can't remember what it looked like? The thing that fell from her hair?" she asked, reaching over to stroke my head. Her hand came away covered in moth scales. Something about her touch repulsed me. It sent strange tremors through my body. A deep primal need to escape overwhelmed me. That familiar revulsion returned, the same feeling that had tormented me for weeks. Without meaning to, I found myself convulsing and panicking, my body trying to thrash violently. But with every limb constrained by silk, I could do nothing but writhe on the floor. I tried desperately to move my hands, to get some grip on the wrapping and tear myself free. But it was useless. I could do nothing except glare at my girlfriend and the enormous shadow behind her, the one that towered above us both, its great wings spanning the floor and ceiling. At some point I grabbed at my jacket and felt something small and hard in my pocket. The cell phone. I knew there was significant risk in using it, but I had no alternatives. I managed to work my hand into my pocket and find it with fumbling fingers. Maya seemed oddly aware of what I was doing, tilting her head like a curious animal as I gripped the device and used every ounce of willpower I had to fight the violent spasms racking my body and activate its flashlight. The webbing ignited immediately. It must have been the adhesive, but flames raced across the silk like it had been soaked in gasoline. Before I realized, it had weakened enough for me to free one arm, Tongues of fire were already spreading across the floor toward my poor neighbor. The burning sensation crawling up my legs and torso was agony beyond description, but I was finally free. I rolled over and began pushing myself up, desperately patting at my body to extinguish the flames. When I looked around, Maya and the shape following her had vanished. For a moment I considered helping my neighbor, but her body was convulsing too violently, and though her eyes were wide open, moths were pouring from her mouth, and I couldn't summon the courage to approach her. All I could think about was escape. The house was burning like kindling. It wasn't far to the kitchen, but fire had already reached there. Smoke billowed upward and, trapped by the ceiling, began filling the air with choking soot. The only exit was the back door, and I stumbled toward it but stopped when I saw Maya standing there. "You really are such a fascinating specimen." I charged past her, but surprisingly she offered no resistance. I simply burst into the open air, my lungs gasping for clean oxygen as I collapsed onto overgrown grass. Looking back, I saw orange flames already leaping from upper-story windows. Left unchecked, the fire would spread to consume the entire block of townhouses. I felt a moment of guilt, but sirens were already wailing in the distance, so someone had noticed and called for help. But it wasn't over. Maya was sitting on the fence. I don't know how she'd gotten there, but she appeared completely undisturbed. "I never imagined that when that heat wave brought me into your home, I'd discover such an intriguing pair of minds," she said. "What a delightful brain to burrow into. I had no idea what I would find." "Let her go," I gasped. "I have," she said with a shrug. "I did months ago, actually. There were some incompatibilities, so it made sense to relocate." She pointed at me and smiled. "I've quite enjoyed living inside your head." Struggling to comprehend her words, but somehow grasping their horrifying implications, I placed a hand on the back of my skull and felt it. Felt her. The contact alone was enough to fill my mouth with a metallic taste while my vision blurred at the edges. Something beneath my scalp shifted and I felt terrible pressure behind my eyes. I had to remove her, and I only knew of one weakness. "Oh well," she said as she watched me fumble for the phone. "Not every relationship needs to last forever to be meaningful." I activated the flashlight and held it against my head. My final memories were of heat and a sudden release of pressure. I couldn't possibly describe it adequately. Something slithered from my skull and Maya waved at me from the fence before she seemed to dissolve into nothing. And then, emptiness. Not even darkness, just complete absence. I wouldn't regain consciousness until the hospital several weeks later. Nothing remained of either house, but they managed to control the fire before it spread further. I'm sure there was still damage to neighboring properties, and I feel guilty about it constantly. I think I was charged with arson, possibly more. I have vague memories of being wheeled into a courtroom. Doctors have puzzled over my condition extensively, and one mentioned amateur surgery. He said I must have practiced it on Maya, based on the body they found in my neighbor's house. But I can't be certain of anything. I'm constantly drifting in and out of reality. Writing this has been challenging. I'm not entirely sure where I am right now. One doctor suggested I might recover somewhat if it were just ordinary brain damage. But he'd never seen anything like my case, so he couldn't be sure. It feels like different doctors every time I see them. Then again, I don't always recognize myself in mirrors. That could be due to the burns, but I think I look considerably older than I should. There is one nurse who's been here long enough to know me. He knows my name, smiles when he sees me, talks about various topics. He seems genuinely interested in me and my memories. I called him over once to remove a moth that had built a web on my window, and he did so with a warm smile. I told him I was terrified of them, and he said he already knew, but not to worry because he'd keep watch over me and ensure nothing harmful happened. I'm grateful he's around. Ever since he started working here, I haven't seen many of the nasty creatures near my room. I suppose he's not bothered by them, at least judging by the moth scales in his hair.